The fog rolled in from San Jose's orchards that September morning in 1922, thick and slow, the way California fog moves when it knows something is about to end. Inside a sprawling mansion that had consumed 4 decades of continuous construction, a woman took her last breath. Sarah Winchester, widow of the Rifle Empire, builder of America's most bewildering architectural labyrinth. The hammering stopped. After 38 years of relentless obsessive construction, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, the silence must have been deafening. The house had 160 rooms, 2,000 doors, 10,000 windows, staircases that climbed into ceilings, doors that opened onto brick walls, windows built into floors. A sprawling, illogical monument to something between madness and grief, between wealth and terror, between the living and the dead she believed were hunting her. But before we discuss the hauntings, the seances, the supposed curse, we need to understand something far more seductive than any ghost story. We need to understand the intoxicating, world-altering power of the Winchester repeating rifle and the staggering fortune it generated. Because Sarah Winchester wasn't just wealthy, she was obscenely, almost incomprehensibly rich, and that wealth, built on innovation, yes, but also on blood, would become both her inheritance and her prison. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company didn't just manufacture firearms, it revolutionized warfare. It changed the mechanics of killing. Before the Winchester rifle, a soldier had to reload after every shot. Slow, cumbersome, vulnerable. But Oliver Winchester's lever-action repeating rifle could fire round after round without stopping, a terrifying advantage that turned battles, slaughtered buffalo herds, and opened the American West with bullets that never seemed to end. Native American tribes called it something else: the gun that destroyed nations, the weapon that brought famine and genocide, the instrument of a continent's theft. The technology was elegant in its brutality. A tubular magazine beneath the barrel held multiple cartridges. A lever mechanism allowed the shooter to eject spent casings and chamber new rounds in one smooth motion. What once took 30 seconds now took 2. In battle, that difference meant everything. A single soldier with a Winchester could hold off dozens of attackers. A cavalry unit, with repeating rifles, could decimate entire villages. The mathematics of violence had fundamentally changed, and the Winchester family held the patent. By the time Sarah married William Wirt Winchester in 1862, the company was already ascending into the stratosphere of American industry. The Civil War created an insatiable demand for repeating rifles. Armies needed speed. Speed meant survival. Survival meant contracts worth millions. The Union Army placed massive orders. Confederate forces desperately tried to capture Winchester rifles from fallen soldiers because their own weapons couldn't compete. After the war, the expansion westward created an entirely new market. Settlers needed protection. Military needed weapons to clear the frontier. Buffalo hunters needed efficiency to slaughter the massive herds that sustained native populations. Adjusted for inflation, the Winchester family fortune at its peak exceeded $400 million in today's currency. $400 million, built on patents, innovation, and the mechanization of death. The company's annual revenue in the 1870s and 1880s regularly exceeded $3 million. In an era when the average American worker earned roughly $500 per year, this wasn't just wealth. This was the kind of capital that could reshape landscapes, influence elections, and build dynasties that would last generations. Sarah's life began as a kind of fairy tale. She was born Sarah Lockwood Pardee in 1839 in New Haven, Connecticut, into a respectable family of modest means. Her father was a skilled carpenter, a detail that becomes almost painfully ironic given what Sarah would later build. She was educated at the finest private schools, unusual for a woman of her era. She spoke 4 languages fluently: English, French, Italian, and Spanish. She was an accomplished pianist, her fingers moving across keys with the same precision that would later sketch architectural impossibilities. She read voraciously: literature, philosophy, history. She had the kind of refined intellectual beauty that attracted ambitious men. When she married William Wirt Winchester on September 30th, 1862, she entered not just wealth, but dynasty. William, known as Willie to intimates, was the only son of Oliver Winchester, the company's founder. He was being groomed to take over the empire. Educated at Yale, connected to New Haven's industrial elite, destined for a life of power and influence. Sarah, at 23, became part of one of America's most powerful families. The wedding was elegant but modest by the standards of their wealth. The Winchesters, despite their fortune, maintained a certain Yankee restraint, a Protestant work ethic that viewed ostentatious displays as vulgar. The young couple settled into a mansion in New Haven, a stately home befitting their status. They had servants, of course, drivers, cooks, maids. The house was filled with the finest furniture, imported carpets, crystal chandeliers. Sarah hosted gatherings for New Haven society, refined affairs with chamber music and intellectual conversation. She was admired for her grace and her mind. She seemed to have everything the Gilded Age promised to those born into or married into the right families. And then the curse, if you believe in curses, began to tighten. In 1866, Sarah gave birth to a daughter, Annie Party Winchester, a child who carried the bloodline of an empire. The nursery had been prepared for months, the finest crib, hand-sewn linens, toys imported from Europe. Sarah, after years of marriage, finally had the family she'd dreamed of. For 6 weeks, the house was filled with the sounds of a newborn, crying, cooing, the rustle of nurses attending to the infant's needs. And then Annie stopped breathing. The official cause of death was listed as marasmus, a wasting disease characterized by severe malnutrition and failure to thrive. Modern medicine might diagnose it differently, perhaps a congenital condition, a digestive disorder, an immune deficiency. But in 1806, doctors had few answers and fewer treatments. The baby simply faded, growing weaker each day until her small heart stopped. She died on July 25th, 1806, 43 days after her birth. Sarah's grief was absolute. She withdrew from society. The nursery was closed, the door locked. She stopped hosting gatherings. She stopped playing piano. Friends reported that she became a ghost in her own home, drifting through rooms in silence, her face frozen in a mask of anguish. William tried to comfort her, but grief of this magnitude creates distances that love cannot always bridge. The mansion in New Haven became a tomb, its elegant rooms now monuments to absence. For 15 years, Sarah existed in this state of suspended mourning. She never had another child, whether by choice or by medical inability, we don't know. But the absence of children, the absence of a future, of continuity, of purpose beyond the present moment, hollowed out something essential in her. She attended church less frequently. She spent more time alone, and according to some accounts, she began to explore spiritualism, a movement that was sweeping through America in the wake of the Civil War's mass casualties. Spiritualism offered something irresistible to the grieving, the possibility of contact with the dead. Through mediums, seances, and various occult practices, believers claimed they could communicate with departed souls. For someone like Sarah, who had lost the only person she'd brought into the world, the appeal was overwhelming. If Annie's spirit still existed somewhere, if death wasn't an absolute ending, then perhaps the pain could be transformed into connection rather than loss. And then, in 1881, the second blow fell. William Wirt Winchester contracted tuberculosis. It was a death sentence. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, killed indiscriminately in the 19th century. Wealth couldn't prevent it. The best doctors in New Haven tried every available treatment, sanitariums, rest cures, dietary regimens. Nothing worked. William wasted away over several months, his body consumed by the bacteria ravaging his lungs. He died on March 7th, 1881, at the age of 43. Sarah, at 41, had now lost both her daughter and her husband. She was utterly alone. But she was also unimaginably wealthy. William's death transferred to Sarah approximately $20 million in liquid assets, cash, bonds, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios. But more importantly, she inherited a 50% ownership stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, which generated an estimated income of $1,000 per day. Per day. In 1881 currency, adjusted for inflation, that's approximately $26,000 every single day for the rest of her life. Passive income, infinite, unstoppable. Dividend payments, capital gains, profit distributions flowing into her accounts whether she lifted a finger or not. She would never run out of money. She could build palaces. She could fund cities. She could do absolutely anything wealth allows, except bring back the dead. If these numbers, these mechanisms of generational wealth, liquidity crisis averted by inheritance, the architecture of capital allocation that determines who survives and who doesn't, if they matter to you, then you understand that history isn't just romance and tragedy. It's operating costs. It's asset portfolios. It's the mathematics of who gets to grieve in mansions and who grieves in tenements. These stories take time to research, and they take even longer to tell. Honestly, that's why this exists. According to the most persistent and tantalizing legend, one that may be partially fabricated but has become inseparable from Sarah's story, she consulted a spiritual medium in Boston shortly after William's death. Desperate for answers about why her life had been systematically destroyed, she sought counsel from the dead. The medium, in some versions named Adam Coons, in others a woman named Mary Baker, allegedly delivered a message that would define the rest of Sarah's existence. The spirits were angry, specifically, the spirits of all those killed by Winchester rifles, thousands upon thousands of souls, soldiers in the Civil War, Native Americans during westward expansion, settlers killed in conflicts, animals slaughtered in buffalo hunts, victims of crimes committed with Winchester weapons, an army of the dead, bound together by the common thread of having been ended by the same technology, and they were hunting the Winchester family. The medium's message, as the legend goes, was chillingly specific. The Winchester family was cursed. The deaths of Annie and William were not natural tragedies, but supernatural retribution. And Sarah was next. The spirits would not rest until every Winchester was in the grave. There was only one way to appease them, only one way to buy time, to survive the haunting that had already begun. She must move west, away from New Haven and its memories. She must purchase land and build a house for the spirits, a house large enough to contain them all, a house so complex, so labyrinthine, so endlessly under construction that the spirits would become confused, lost in its corridors, unable to find her. And she must never stop building. The moment construction ceased, the moment the hammers went silent, the spirits would locate her, and she would die. Whether this seance actually happened, whether Sarah truly believed this message, whether it was a psychological framework she constructed to give meaning to meaningless tragedy, or whether it was largely invented by journalists and tour operators decades later, we'll never know with absolute certainty. Sarah left behind almost no personal writings, no diary, no memoir, no letters that survived which detail her inner beliefs. But what we do know, what is documented and verified, is that Sarah Winchester sold her New Haven mansion in 1884, left Connecticut behind, and traveled to California. She purchased an unfinished farmhouse in San Jose, a modest 8-room structure sitting on 44 acres of land in the Santa Clara Valley. The property cost approximately $25,000, a trivial sum for someone with her resources. The house was unremarkable. The land was pleasant, surrounded by orchards and gardens, close enough to San Jose for supplies, but isolated enough for privacy. She hired carpenters, she ordered materials, she began to build, and she never stopped. Before you dismiss Sarah as simply mad, pause for a moment and ask yourself, what would you do with infinite wealth and unbearable grief? What monuments would you build to keep the past alive, or to keep the future at bay? If this made you pause, that pause matters. For 38 years, construction continued without interruption. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. The farmhouse grew like a malignant organism, spreading in all directions, consuming itself and rebuilding, a constantly evolving structure that obeyed no architectural logic, no building codes, no conventional understanding of how houses should be designed. At its peak, Sarah employed 22 carpenters simultaneously, working in rotating shifts to ensure the hammering never stopped. She paid them exceptionally well, approximately $3 per day, when the average wage for skilled carpenters was closer to $1.50. She provided overtime bonuses, offered room and board on the property for those who wanted it, and gave annual raises. She was a demanding employer, exacting in her standards, but she wasn't cruel. Workers who stayed with her for years spoke of her with a mixture of confusion and respect. She expected perfection, but she compensated fairly. The head carpenter for over a decade was a Swedish immigrant named John Hansen. He spoke broken English but possessed an almost supernatural ability to read Sarah's cryptic architectural sketches, rough drawings on scraps of paper that would arrive at the worksite each morning with instructions for the day. Hansen became the interpreter between Sarah's vision and physical reality. He trained crews, solved impossible engineering problems, and somehow transformed her nonsensical designs into structures that, against all odds, actually stood. Maria Gonzalez served as the head housekeeper, managing a staff of maids who faced a unique challenge, cleaning and maintaining a house where rooms were constantly being added, hallways rearranged, and entire wings sealed off or demolished. The staff needed maps. Literally, new employees were given orientation tours that could last days, and even veteran servants sometimes got lost in the sprawling maze. Maria developed a system of colored ribbons tied to doorknobs to help maids navigate: blue for second floor bedrooms, red for servant passages, yellow for storage areas. The gardens were maintained by a rotating crew of Chinese and Japanese immigrant workers who transformed the 44 acres into an agricultural wonder. Sarah didn't just want ornamental gardens, she wanted productive ones. The grounds featured orchards of apricots, plums, cherries, and walnuts. There were vegetable gardens, berry patches, and greenhouse facilities. The estate was largely self-sufficient, producing most of its own food. Surplus produce was sold at local markets, generating income that offset some of the operating costs, a peculiar bit of practicality from a woman supposedly building a house for ghosts. But the house itself defied all practicality. The mansion grew to contain 160 rooms, though the exact count is debated because Sarah constantly changed the configuration. 2,000 doors, many of which opened onto brick walls or led nowhere. 10,000 windows, including windows installed in floors so you could look down into rooms below, and interior windows that faced other interior rooms, creating strange cascades of filtered light through multiple layers of glass. There were 47 fireplaces, many of them purely decorative, lacking chimneys or flues that would actually allow smoke to escape. 13 bathrooms, an astonishing number for the era, many featuring ornate tilework and advanced plumbing systems that were cutting edge for the 1890s. Sarah was fascinated by modern technology. The house had carbide gas lights before electricity was available, then was one of the first private residences in California to be fully electrified. She installed early push-button call systems so she could summon servants from any room. Staircases became her obsession. There were 40 staircases scattered throughout the house, many of them deeply strange. One staircase climbed 7 flights but rose only 9 feet in total elevation. Each step was approximately 2 inches tall, designed, some believe, to accommodate Sarah's worsening arthritis in later years. Another staircase climbed directly into a ceiling and stopped, leading nowhere. Some staircases dead-ended at walls. Others opened onto steep drops into gardens below. Doors were equally bizarre. A beautiful hand-carved door in one hallway opened onto a blank brick wall. Another door, when opened, revealed a 15-foot drop to the lawn below. No landing, no stairs, just empty space. Some doors were tiny, barely 2 feet tall. forcing anyone entering to crouch awkwardly. Others were normal-sized, but opened onto impossibly narrow closets that seemed to serve no function. The architectural chaos, however, contained moments of stunning beauty. The ballroom featured exquisite parquet floors constructed from 6 different types of hardwood: mahogany, teak, rosewood, white maple, black oak, and ash, arranged in intricate geometric patterns. But the room had no furnishings, no chairs, no chandelier, just an empty, echoing space that Sarah allegedly used to host spirits, not people. The Tiffany Daisy bedroom contained an art glass window that cost approximately $1,500 in 1890s currency, over $45,000 today. The window depicted daisies and other flowers in vibrant stained glass, designed to catch the morning light. But here's the disturbing detail. The window faced an interior wall. It received no natural light. Sarah had a light installed behind the wall specifically to illuminate the window artificially, a window built to look outside, permanently trapped looking at nothing. Throughout the house, Sarah incorporated the number 13 obsessively. 13 bathrooms, 13 steps in certain staircases, 13 window panes in specific rooms, 13 hooks in the seance room, 13 drain holes in the sinks, chandeliers with 13 lights. Some historians believe this was superstition, 13 being considered unlucky. Perhaps Sarah was trying to harness or neutralize its power. Others think it was numerology, a symbolic language she believed the spirits could read. The seance room sat at the heart of the labyrinth, accessible only through a series of hidden passages. To reach it, you had to pass through doors that appeared to be ordinary closets, navigate hallways that doubled back on themselves, and finally arrive at a small, blue-painted room with a single entrance and no windows. Inside there was a cabinet, a small table, and a chair. Sarah reportedly entered this room every night at midnight, dressed in a blue robe, carrying a candle. She would lock herself inside and commune with the spirits until 2 in the morning. No one was allowed to disturb her. Not servants, not guests, not even during emergencies. What happened in that room? What did Sarah believe she was experiencing? Did she hear voices? Did she see apparitions? Was she genuinely communicating with something beyond the physical world? Or was she engaged in a nightly ritual of self-delusion, a theatrical performance for an audience of one? We have no testimony from Sarah herself, only the locked door and the stories told by servants who heard her speaking, though whether to spirits or to herself, they couldn't say. If you're still here, you're here for more than spectacle. You're here because you sense something deeper beneath the surface. The question of what wealth does to the soul when grief is the engine and fear is the architect. But while Sarah communed with ghosts, real people were living and dying around her. Let's talk about them in detail, because every ghost story has living victims, and every monument to grief is built on invisible labor. The carpenters worked brutal hours. Despite being well compensated, the physical toll was immense. Construction accidents were common. A carpenter named Thomas Murphy fell from scaffolding while working on a third-story addition in 1891. He broke both legs and was unable to work for 6 months. Sarah paid his medical bills and his full salary during recovery, a rare act of employer compassion for the era. But accidents kept happening. Fingers lost to saws, backs injured moving heavy timber, respiratory problems from sawdust and the fumes of paint and varnish. He described hallways that seemed to shift, doors that he swore led to one room but opened onto another, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Whether this was genuine supernatural experience, psychological distortion caused by the house's disorienting design, or simply the words of a man who found the work too demanding, we can't know. But his story spread, and it became increasingly difficult for Sarah to hire new workers. The house developed a reputation locally as cursed or haunted, and only those desperate for work or drawn by the high wages were willing to sign on. The servants inside the house faced their own challenges. Maids reported objects that moved on their own, keys placed on one table found on another, furniture that seemed to rearrange itself overnight. doors that wouldn't stay closed no matter how firmly latched, cold drafts in sealed rooms with no windows, footsteps in empty hallways, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the house at night. One maid, a young Irish immigrant named Henrietta Severs, worked at the mansion from 1896 to 1902. Years later, in an interview conducted in the 1930s, she described an incident that she swore was true. She was cleaning one of the upstairs bedrooms in the late afternoon when she heard a child crying. It was faint but distinct. She followed the sound through several rooms, but it always seemed to be coming from the next room, just out of reach. Finally, she arrived at a sealed door, one that Sarah had ordered permanently locked. The crying seemed to come from behind it. Henrietta reported this to Maria Gonzalez, who told her, firmly, never to speak of it again. "There are no children in this house," Maria said. "There never have been." But Sarah, overhearing the conversation, simply looked at Henrietta and said, "She visits sometimes. She's lonely." Was this Annie? Was Sarah hearing her dead daughter's voice in the empty rooms? Was this shared psychosis, the power of suggestion, causing servants to experience what they expected to experience in a house they'd been told was haunted? Or was something genuinely inexplicable occurring in that architecturally impossible structure? The groundskeepers had their own stories. Strange lights in windows of unoccupied wings, figures glimpsed in upper story windows that, upon investigation, were revealed to be rooms with no floor, just empty space where the floor had been removed during renovations. Sounds of hammering and construction coming from areas where no one was working. The estate, remember, covered 44 acres, much of it orchard and garden, and the workers who tended those grounds often labored alone, far from the main house. More than one reported feeling watched while pruning trees or harvesting fruit. And then there were the financial costs, staggering in their scope. Estimates suggest Sarah spent approximately $5.5 million on the house over 38 years. Adjusted for inflation to modern dollars, that's somewhere between $150 million and $200 million, depending on the calculation method. To put that in perspective, that's more than the construction costs of many major public buildings of the era. The Boston Public Library, a massive civic project, cost approximately $2.5 million. Sarah spent more than twice that amount on a private residence she shared with no one. Materials were sourced from around the world: Italian marble for fireplaces, art glass from Tiffany Studios in New York, teak and mahogany imported from South America and Southeast Asia, hardware, hinges, locks, doorknobs, custom forged by local blacksmiths to Sarah's exact specifications. Each chandelier, each window, each decorative element had to be transported to San Jose, then carried through the narrow hallways and stairways of an ever-expanding structure. The labor costs alone were astronomical. 22 carpenters at $3 per day equals $66 per day in wages, plus overtime, plus bonuses. Add the servants, the groundskeepers, the cooks, the drivers. Add the cost of feeding and housing those who lived on site. Add the maintenance costs for 44 acres of gardens, orchards, and grounds. Add property taxes, insurance, utilities. The estate's operating costs likely exceeded $50,000 per year, over $1.5 million in modern currency, just to keep the house running. Yet even with this staggering expenditure, Sarah's fortune barely diminished. Her daily income from Winchester Repeating Arms Company dividends was so vast that even pouring $150 million into construction and decades of operational costs left her extraordinarily wealthy at the time of her death. Her estate was valued at approximately $4.5 million in 1922, well over $70 million today. That's the mathematics of generational wealth. That's what capital gains from industrial monopolies actually look like in practice. It's not just having money. It's having money that reproduces itself faster than you can possibly spend it, even when you're actively trying. Even when you're building architectural madness for 4 decades. On April 18, 1906, at 5:13 in the morning, the San Francisco earthquake struck. The mansion, still under frenetic construction, shook violently. The ground rolled in waves. Walls collapsed. Chimneys crumbled. Plaster rained from ceilings. The unfinished front section of the house, a seven-story tower that Sarah had been building for years, the tallest structure on the property, pancaked down onto itself in a roar of splintering wood and shattering glass. Sarah was asleep in her bedroom when the quake hit. The bedroom was located in a section of the house that partially collapsed, trapping her inside. Beams fell across doorways. Furniture overturned, blocking exits. She was stuck, surrounded by rubble, in darkness for several hours while workers frantically dug through the wreckage. When they finally freed her, she was physically unharmed but psychologically shattered. She emerged from the rubble convinced that the earthquake was a message from the spirits. She had been building upward, reaching toward heaven with that seven-story tower. The spirits were angry. They didn't want her reaching up. They wanted her to stay grounded, to spread outward, to burrow inward. From that day forward, Sarah ordered all construction to focus on expanding outward and downward, never upward again. The ruined tower was never rebuilt. Its wreckage was sealed off, walled up, and Sarah never entered that section of the house again. To this day, when you tour the Winchester Mystery House, you can see where the earthquake damage was simply incorporated into the structure, a scar the house still bears. Some psychologists and historians have speculated extensively about Sarah's mental state. Modern diagnoses might include obsessive-compulsive disorder, prolonged traumatic grief that manifested as compulsive behavior, or perhaps a dissociative disorder that allowed her to construct an elaborate alternate reality in which her nightly rituals had genuine power. Building became ritual. Ritual became identity. She couldn't stop because stopping meant confronting the emptiness. The house was a distraction vast enough to fill decades. It was a project infinite enough to justify waking up every morning. It gave her purpose in a life that had lost all purpose. But let's be brutally honest about something else. Sarah wasn't just a victim of grief or superstition. She was also complicit in the empire that enabled her isolation. Every dollar she spent came from rifles, from weapons that killed hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions over the decades of the Winchester Company's operation, Native American tribes decimated. The Winchester rifle was the weapon of choice during the Indian Wars. Tribes that had survived for millennia were shattered within decades, in part because of the repeating rifle's efficiency. The buffalo herds that sustained plains cultures were exterminated, an estimated 30 to 60 million buffalo killed between 1830 and 1890. Winchester rifles were the primary tool of that genocide. Professional buffalo hunters could kill dozens of animals per day, their rifles allowing them to fire continuously without the reload delays that had previously limited slaughter. Soldiers shot in wars, foreign and domestic, the Spanish-American War, conflicts in the Philippines, labor strikes brutally suppressed by armed Pinkertons and militias. The Winchester rifle became synonymous with American violence, both official and unofficial. The Winchester rifle was a marvel of engineering and a monument to violence, and Sarah lived in supreme luxury because of it. Did she feel guilt? Did she believe, consciously or unconsciously, that the spirits hunting her were real, actual souls with legitimate grievances? Or was the spiritualism a psychological framework she constructed to process inherited complicity without actually confronting it directly? This is where the story stops being a ghost story and starts being a story about all of us. Because we all inherit systems, we all benefit in varying degrees from violence we didn't personally commit, and we all build labyrinths, distractions, justifications, complexities to avoid confronting the straight lines connecting our comfort to others' suffering. If you're thinking about that right now, then something in this story is working the way it should. That's not entertainment. That's recognition. And recognition, honestly, is worth more than applause. Sarah never gave interviews. She never explained herself publicly. There are only a handful of photographs of her, and in all of them she looks severe, uncomfortable, her face giving away nothing. She was intensely private, almost pathologically so. She built walls, literal and metaphorical, between herself and the world. The few people who knew her personally left contradictory accounts. Some described her as kind and generous, a philanthropist who quietly funded local schools and hospitals, who paid her workers well and treated them with respect. Others described her as cold and strange, obsessed with invisible forces, impossible to truly know. Both versions were probably true. Human beings contain multitudes, and trauma reshapes us in complex ways. In her later years, Sarah's health declined significantly. She developed severe rheumatoid arthritis that made movement painful. Her hands, once so elegant on piano keys, became twisted and stiff. Navigating the endless corridors of her own creation became increasingly difficult. She spent more time in a few select rooms, particularly a small bedroom where she eventually died. The construction slowed slightly, but never fully stopped. Even in her 70s, she was still ordering modifications, still sketching additions, still keeping the hammers swinging. She also became more reclusive. She stopped receiving guests almost entirely. The few friends she had maintained contact with died or drifted away. Her family in Connecticut had long since given up trying to understand her. She existed in almost total isolation, surrounded by servants but utterly alone, wandering the corridors of a house that had become her entire world. On September 4th, 1922, Sarah went to bed in her small bedroom. She was 83 years old. Her breathing had become labored in recent days. Her heart was failing. She slipped into unconsciousness during the night and never woke up. She died on September 5th, 1922, in her sleep. The carpenters working the night shift reportedly said they heard the hammers stop at the exact moment of her death, though this is almost certainly romantic embellishment. What is certain is that construction ceased immediately and permanently. The workers were dismissed. The house, frozen mid-project, stood incomplete, half-finished rooms, unpainted walls, nails still protruding from beams, tools abandoned where they lay. Her will was surprisingly conventional and meticulously detailed. She left her estate to her niece, Frances Marriott, along with specific instructions to distribute funds to various charities and longtime employees. She left substantial bequests to hospitals, including a children's hospital, perhaps an echo of the daughter she'd lost. She left money to former servants, even those who had left her employment years earlier. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company shares were to be sold and the proceeds distributed according to her instructions, but she left no explanation for the house, no letter, no memoir, no key to understanding the labyrinth she had created, no instructions about what should be done with it. It was as if the house had consumed her so completely that she couldn't conceive of it existing without her, couldn't imagine a world in which it needed explanation. Frances Marriott inherited a dilemma. The house was enormous, bizarre, expensive to maintain, and had no practical use. Selling it to a private buyer seemed impossible. Who would want to live in a 160-room maze? Within months, the estate was sold to a group of investors who recognized its commercial potential. They understood something important. The house's madness was its value. The legend, already potent during Sarah's lifetime, metastasized after her death. Newspapers published sensational accounts, often fabricated or exaggerated. Tour guides embellished stories. The narrative became codified. Sarah Winchester, driven mad by guilt and grief, spent her fortune building a house to confuse ghosts, and now those ghosts still walk the corridors. It was irresistible. It combined wealth, tragedy, spiritualism, and architecture into a perfect package. Ghost hunters arrived almost immediately. Harry Houdini, the famous magician and skeptic who made a career of debunking spiritualists, visited in 1924. He was unimpressed, declaring the house architecturally interesting but not genuinely haunted. But his skepticism did nothing to dampen public enthusiasm. Psychics conducted investigations. Paranormal researchers brought early recording equipment, hoping to capture spirit voices. Stories proliferated: phantom footsteps, disembodied voices, cold spots that moved through rooms, apparitions of a woman in Victorian dress wandering the hallways. Some claim to see Sarah herself, still wearing her blue seance robe, still searching, still building, still fleeing whatever pursued her in life, and now in death. Others reported seeing a man in work clothes, John Hanson, the head carpenter perhaps, still trying to fulfill Sarah's impossible instructions, children's laughter echoing through empty rooms, Annie, the daughter who died at 6 weeks, finally able to play in the house her mother built for her. Whether any of this is real depends entirely on what you believe about death, consciousness, and the possibility that trauma can imprint itself onto physical space. The house certainly feels haunted. The disorienting architecture creates psychological effects: vertigo, confusion, unease. The knowledge of Sarah's story primes visitors to interpret ambiguous stimuli as supernatural. Creaking floorboards become footsteps. Wind through cracks becomes whispers. Shadows become figures. But some experiences reported by staff and visitors are harder to dismiss. Security guards who worked night shifts in the 1980s and 90s consistently reported doors locking themselves from the inside, requiring maintenance staff to remove hinges to gain entry, alarm systems that triggered in sealed sections of the house where no one could physically enter, photographs showing anomalies, orbs, mists, occasionally something that looks almost like a figure. In 2016, a team of paranormal investigators conducted a multi-day investigation using thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and audio recording equipment. They documented numerous anomalies, temperature drops of 15 to 20 degrees in specific rooms with no apparent cause, electromagnetic spikes that corresponded to no electrical wiring or devices, and several audio recordings that, when analyzed, seemed to contain words, though ambiguous and open to interpretation. Are these evidence of genuine paranormal activity, or are they the result of an old house with quirky architecture, outdated systems, and the psychological expectations of investigators looking for ghosts? The debate continues, and the Winchester Mystery House has become one of the most investigated paranormal sites in America. Today, the Winchester Mystery House draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. You can take guided tours through the twisting corridors, marvel at the staircases to nowhere, peer into the seance room where Sarah allegedly communed with spirits, and stand in the ballroom where she hosted invisible guests. The tours are theatrical, the guides telling ghost stories with practiced dramatic flair. There are special Halloween events, flashlight tours at night, and premium paranormal investigations where enthusiasts can bring their own equipment and search for evidence of the afterlife. The house has been featured in countless television shows, documentaries, and films. It's become a cultural icon, a symbol of American Gothic, a monument to the strange ways grief and wealth can combine to produce something utterly unique. It's been analyzed by architects, psychologists, historians, and paranormal researchers, each discipline finding something different in its endless corridors. But here's what often gets lost in the ghost stories and architectural oddities. The house is fundamentally a monument to unresolved guilt. Sarah Winchester inherited a fortune built on rifles that killed countless people. Soldiers, Native Americans, animals, settlers, victims of crime. She never used a Winchester rifle herself. She never designed one. She never ordered anyone's death. Yet she lived in supreme comfort because others did all those things. When she inherited that fortune, she had choices. She could have divested entirely, donated the money to causes that healed rather than harmed. She could have funded Native American communities devastated by the weapons that built her wealth. She could have established hospitals, schools, institutions that gave back more than they took. Some wealthy families of the era did exactly that. The Carnegies, the Rockefellers, using their industrial fortunes to build libraries, universities, and foundations. Instead, Sarah built a labyrinth, a monument to avoidance, a physical manifestation of psychological escape. The house allowed her to be perpetually busy, perpetually distracted, perpetually engaged in a project vast enough to fill every minute of every day without ever having to confront the fundamental question, what do I owe? Maybe she was genuinely haunted by spirits. Maybe the seances were real, and she truly heard voices calling for vengeance. Or maybe the haunting was entirely internal, the inescapable knowledge that her comfort was soaked in blood, and no amount of construction could ever build her way out of that truth. Maybe the house wasn't meant to confuse ghosts. Maybe it was meant to confuse herself, to lose herself in endless hallways so she wouldn't have to walk the straight line, connecting her wealth to the bodies it required. This is the real curse, not supernatural, not spirits, but the inescapable reality that some debts can't be paid with construction, some hauntings can't be escaped with wealth, and some labyrinths, no matter how vast, only lead deeper into yourself. Before we end, ask yourself this: how many labyrinths are you building? What straight lines are you avoiding? What systems do you inherit and benefit from without examining too closely? Because Sarah Winchester's story isn't ancient history. It's a template that keeps repeating. The names change, the industries change, but the pattern remains: wealth built on hidden costs, grief that never confronts complicity, and architecture designed to distract rather than resolve. The Winchester Mystery House stands today as a monument, yes, but not to ghosts, to the architecture of avoidance, to what happens when infinite resources meet unresolved trauma, to the human capacity to build anything except the courage to face ourselves. If this story made you think about inheritance differently, about what we carry forward, what we refuse to face, and what we build to avoid reckoning, then maybe that's the real reason these stories matter. They're not just about the past. They're about the patterns we're still repeating, the labyrinths we're still building, the ghosts we're still pretending aren't there. And if you're still here, still thinking, still questioning the easy answers and the comfortable myths, then you already understand why this kind of storytelling exists, not to give you ghosts to fear, but to show you the architecture of how we hide from truth. That's worth preserving, that's worth supporting, that's worth carrying forward into whatever labyrinth you're building next. The hammering stopped on September 5th, 1922. The construction ended, the workers went home. The house fell silent for the first time in 38 years. But the questions Sarah left behind are still echoing through those hallways, still waiting for answers, still haunting anyone willing to listen. 2,000 doors, 160 rooms, 10,000 windows, and not a single one of them opened onto peace. Not a single one led to resolution. They just led to more hallways, more doors, more questions spiraling inward toward a center that Sarah spent her entire fortune making sure she'd never reach. She died alone in a small bedroom, surrounded by architectural chaos, her life's work forever unfinished. The spirits, if they existed, never stopped chasing her. The guilt, if she felt it, never found absolution. The grief never transformed into anything resembling peace, just an empty house, a fortune spent